Good evening and welcome to the 12th Annual Senior Thesis Disputatio. We are so glad that you've chosen to join us tonight. My name is Amanda Wortham, and it has been my distinct honor to be the rhetoric teacher for this fine group of young people for the past few years. It has been a true joy to work alongside them as they constructed their senior thesis presentations. I am so excited for them to share their work with you tonight. The senior thesis process is quite an undertaking, and a host of people have contributed to the fruition of these students' labors. We would like to take this opportunity to thank them. First, I would like to thank the parents of these seniors for their incredible support and encouragement during the thesis process. We have the very best parents at ECCS, and your invaluable encouragement has not gone unnoticed. You have been gracious, kind, optimistic, and patient supporters of your children, and your faithful presence has made tonight possible. We would also like to thank our principals, Mrs. Dawn Hensley and Mrs. Jennifer Scott, our headmaster, Mr. McGinnis, our faculty advisors, and all of the teachers who contributed to these students' education. Thank you for guiding their research, reading their drafts, assisting them in their efforts, and training them to be careful, thoughtful, and charitable scholars. We would also like to thank our grammar school teachers for laying a strong foundation for these students. The thesis projects are truly the culmination of years of classical training, and we are so grateful for every teacher who contributed to that effort. We would also like to thank the administrative staff who assisted us with organizing this year's thesis presentations. Thank you for assisting us with all of the logistical details that this night involves. Also, we would like to thank Mr. Pike for making the technical arrangements for us to live stream tonight's presentations. I would also like to personally thank Dr. Wendy Kautz for all of the time that she's invested in reading, grading, and discussing these topics with the students. This night would not be possible without her invaluable leadership, mentorship, and patience. Thank you, Dr. Kautz. Dr. Kautz and I would also like to extend our appreciation to our own families for the patience that they offered while we graded thesis drafts. This is a time-intensive job, and our families were gracious and diligent throughout the process. We appreciate everyone who took on extra responsibilities at home while we spent time serving our students. Finally, we would like to thank the students themselves for all of their hard work during this process. They have made themselves experts on their chosen subjects, worked diligently to craft persuasive arguments, and invested time to present those arguments beautifully and winsomely. Teaching is a calling, and we fulfill our obligation out of obedience to God. You make it a joy. I do have a few housekeeping notes to offer before we begin the presentations. If you're joining us online, welcome. We are so glad that you're here. If you're joining us in person, please remember to silence your cell phone and refrain from moving around during the speeches. If you must leave or re-enter, please do so between presentations. We would also like to remind you to kindly leave your mask on for the duration of the time that you're in the building. Whether you are here in person or watching from home, we invite you to submit questions for our seniors to answer after the presentations. Please follow the directions on the screen to send your questions to the moderator. After every presentation, selected questions will be presented for the students to answer. Please enjoy tonight's senior thesis presentations given by the class of 2021.
Superman gave up his American citizenship to transform into a global hero. When this happened, he was seen in the Middle East, aiding the people in many ways. The comics and superheroes mirror changes and progressions in American society and all over the world. Audiences are drawn to superhero stories because the superhero is both familiar and fantastic, simultaneously offering encouragement and an escape. First, we love superheroes because we see them develop and go through many struggles, and despite superpowers, we can still relate to them. Secondly, we love superheroes because they reflect what is going on nationally on a historic and cultural level. Lastly, we love superheroes because they echo archetypal themes that are very familiar to everyone. First, we love superheroes because we have seen them develop and face many struggles, and we can relate to them. One way we can relate to superheroes is through their strengths and weaknesses. Usually, superheroes are normal human beings who are transformed by some unusual event, either through birth or through an accident or gift. For example, the Flash is a normal person who worked as a detective until, when lightning struck his laboratory, he gained the power of super speed. Though the Flash and other superheroes have superpowers, all superheroes have weaknesses. For example, the Flash's main weaknesses are being in areas of low gravity or the freezing cold. Superman and Supergirl's weaknesses are being weakness is kryptonite, and Spider-Man can run out of web shooters. Just like ordinary people, some people have emotional weaknesses that haunt them, like Captain America's past during World War II, or Batman's grief over the death of his parents. Superheroes are made more relatable through their strengths and weaknesses, because it shows audiences that everyone, even powerful people, exhibit forms of strength and weakness in their own lives. Superheroes stand up to challenges that come their way. For example, audiences watch how Peter Parker navigates his way through high school, just like any other teenager, and when he becomes Spider-Man, how he must take responsibility for his new powers. Peter Parker was just a regular, nerdy, bullied high schooler, but once he is bitten by a radioactive spider, his whole world has changed. As he learns to use his powers, he makes a few mistakes on the way and learns that with great power comes great responsibility. As audiences watch Spider-Man face many trials, they can be encouraged in their own lives through his relatable character. If superheroes were perfect, people might lose interest because they would be unrelatable. For example, Superman was created with no weaknesses. Then the sales of comics dropped because he simply became boring. Writers introduced kryptonite, and the people's interest in Superman was piqued again. In his book Super History, Jeffrey K. Johnson states that the less powerful Superman promised to be, the more relatable. If superheroes were indestructible and had no weaknesses, they cannot be considered heroic at all because they would not be sacrificing themselves, since they would never die or get hurt. People also like to imagine that they are superheroes themselves and what choices they would make in situations of struggles and weaknesses. Because we can easily relate to superheroes, they can serve as a coping method and comfort in hard times. For example, Spider-Man experiences many tragedies in his lifetime. First, his parents died in a plane crash when he was younger. Then he lived with his aunt and uncle, but his uncle was killed by armed robbers. The fact that Peter could have stopped those robbers from doing that really grieves him. In The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Spider-Man loses his girlfriend Gwen Stacy when he is fighting the Green Goblin. And lastly, Spider-Man also loses a dear friend and mentor, Iron Man. Spider-Man shines as an example how someone can lose almost everything and yet be strong and courageous through it all. Audiences love Spider-Man so much because he is possibly one of the most relatable superheroes of them all, and as a result, his stories are so encouraging to audiences around the world. Second, people love superheroes because they reflect what is going on nationally on a historic and cultural level. Since the creation of the comic book heroes, superheroes have always mirrored struggles and conflicts in society through their stories. In the comics, superheroes fought against the injustices of the time by opposing the KKK, supporting women's rights, and fighting against the Nazis during World War II. In the 1940s, Superman fought against the KKK in radio dramas called The Adventures of Superman. American families loved listening into these stories, which taught people about the evil of the KKK and encouraged families to strive for change. These stories can encourage people not to be afraid to act against the injustices of the time and stand up for what is right. In the comics, Wonder Woman fights for women's rights, and Superman and Captain America fight for America during World War II. Wonder Woman symbolizes the power of women and femininity all throughout the superhero world. The creators of Wonder Woman made her an equal of Superman, and she was created to question the stereotypes associated with women. At the same time, both Superman and Captain America fought in World War II against Hitler and the Nazis. These comics encouraged soldiers to go into battle and fight for their country, and families learned about what was happening in the war. Also, superheroes address modern politics. For example, in Captain America Civil War, the superheroes must decide if they should be under government control or stay independent, which causes them to split into two different factions. Captain America argues against working under the UN because he believes the government control invades our freedom, while Iron Man wants to ally with the UN because he believes the Avengers are out of control and need regulations. Just like these superheroes, many people today question the amount of power government should have over people. As audiences watch superheroes struggle to take on issues of political and cultural significance, the connection between the audience and the superheroes is strengthened. Lastly, we love superheroes because they echo archetypal themes that resonate with everyone. An example of an archetypal theme is the good versus evil storyline. Throughout these superhero stories, we see the continual fight between good and evil. As people watch or read about superheroes, they may desire a hero in their own life, someone who can aid them in hard times and come in to save the day. Superheroes can speak to all people's deep need for a savior, who is Jesus Christ. Jesus is the only one who can ultimately provide for our needs, and some superhero stories even try to represent Jesus' character. Superhero stories reflect biblical stories. For example, Superman can exemplify Jesus Christ. As it says in the book, The Gospel According to Superheroes, he descended from heaven and came to earth as a child, like Jesus. He was sent by a heavenly Father. He looked human, but he was so much more than human. He was the perfect man, yet godlike in his powers. Superman is not Christ, but some of the same aspects that draw humankind to Jesus have also made Superman an enduring figure in popular culture. What people long for in life is a savior that is stronger than the average man, that can ultimately save them. That is one reason why Superman and Jesus are so intriguing. Thor and Loki also represent the archetype of feuding brothers. One example of this from the Bible is the story of Cain and Abel. Just as Cain was jealous of Abel, since his offering was accepted by the Lord, Loki was jealous of Thor's praises and position he acquired in life, so he sought vengeance like Cain. This story represents timeless truths of action. When faced with tragedy and chaos, people can either choose to be like Abel and standing up and facing the unknown with sacrifice and appropriate attitude, or they can be like Cain and make inappropriate sacrifices and wallow in jealousy and resentment. This story and many more alike have been continually passed down through generation to generation, and they never grow old. The reason people want to hear the same stories told and retold is because humans live in a story that has meaning, and superheroes represent patterns of action and modes of being in the story of humans. These stories, in the end, all connect to the real story of the world, which is the Bible. In the end, superhero stories encourage people to strive to do good. All through the good and the bad, superheroes shine through the darkness and the challenges everything our society throws at them. Their choices display numerous acts of virtue while they fight for a greater society and the good in humanity. People can watch superheroes do this and be encouraged to strive for change in themselves and in the world. In his article, Why People Are So Fascinated with Superhero Movies, Andrew Berryhill states that what sets them apart and what gives people hope is that the strength of their character and morality allows them to overcome such terrible experiences to do good in the world. Just as it states in the book Titans, someone may ask, how can movies about superheroes who can't possibly exist help us think about such issues today? One great writer, C.S. Lewis, explains that sometimes fairy tales can do a better job of saying what the author means to say than more realistic stories. For example, the Chronicles of Narnia series takes place in imaginary worlds, but underneath this fantasy is a basic retelling of the Gospels. Also in the Bible, Jesus teaches through parables to help people understand important truths with simple analogies. Another famous author, J.A.R. Tolkien, states that fairy stories have more permanent and fundamental things to talk about. In the book Titans, it explains that, according to Tolkien, These kind of stories exist to promise the reader that in spite of the conflict and loss we suffer, better things lie ahead than behind. All superhero stories deal with good versus evil, and there are real losses in these stories, but ultimately in the end, good always wins, and this can give audiences hope about the future. Superheroes have made a cultural impact in recent history. Over the years, superheroes have aged with us. As children, we may only see the surface level of their appeal and not the deep meaning behind them, but we soon realize that behind the superhero with superpowers is a normal human being. They go through some of the same experiences we do, the good and the bad. This is the reason why millions of people continually go to the movies or read comics about superheroes. So next time you watch or read about your favorite superhero, swing into action, blasting the enemies away, and saving the world from utter destruction, contemplate what piques your interest about them. Chances are, superheroes may appeal to you more deeply than what you think. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. What made you interested in this topic?
Well, I've always been kind of interested in superheroes, and when I was doing this thesis, I wanted to pick a topic that I would be interested in knowing more about, because I'm not like the most knowledgeable about Marvel and superheroes, like I'm not like the biggest fan in the world, but I wanted to do something that would be fun and that wouldn't be quite as boring to me, so that's why I picked that topic.
What was something in your research that surprised you?
I was surprised about the radio show that Superman did. I didn't know that they had a radio show with Superman, and they talked about him fighting the KKK. That surprised me. I didn't know about that, so that was pretty cool.
In your research, what did you find to be the most intriguing weakness for a superhero?
Ooh. Most intriguing weakness. There's a lot of weaknesses in superheroes, that are very intriguing because they reflect our character. And I think a lot of weaknesses, I don't know about one particular one that intrigued me, but I would say that collectively a lot of them did, just because superheroes aren't perfect, and so they kind of reflect how we are because we're not perfect, and just like that connection between how superheroes aren't perfect and how we're not perfect, and how we can kind of relate through that. So.
Are there any important differences between male and female superheroes?
I don't think there's a whole lot of differences. I would think both of them are very, very appealing, both men and women superheroes. And I wouldn't say one's like a woman superhero, there's a greater than the other. I think they're both very influential, both male and female superheroes.
Can you love superheroes too much?
Yes. If you idolize superheroes, yes, I think you can definitely love superheroes too much.
Which modern cultural issues are superheroes tackling today?
I would say some injustices now. There's a lot of superhero stories reflect what is going on now, and that's how their stories kind of create. So when you're watching superheroes, or definitely read about comics that come out recently, you can definitely see what's going on in our society through the comics, and it kind of reflects through that.
Who is your favorite superhero?
Spider-Man. That's the first superhero movie I watched for Marvel, and his character is so appealing to me. I think he's very intriguing, and just like me, he's a teenager, and I've always loved him. So,
if you could recommend one of your sources to someone who is interested in your topic, which one would you recommend?
If you want to learn about the more history-wise of superheroes, there's a book called Super History by Jeffrey K. Johnson, and it's really interesting because it talks about the history of all the superheroes I talked about.
Thank you, Robin.
Our next speaker tonight is Andrew Simoneaux. His advisor was Dr. Bill Poole, and his topic is how World War II helped usher us into the modern era.
One morning, the Jones family awoke as they were excited for the family trip to New York. They drove to the airport, boarded the jet airliner, and set off. While they were there, they took a helicopter tour of the city and saw the city from a bird's eye view. After seeing a few more famous locations like Times Square and the Statue of Liberty, they headed home. This kind of travel utilizes inventions such as jet engines and helicopters, technology we take for granted. Many advancements that we enjoy as routine parts of our lives are made possible by discoveries and technologies from World War II. During World War II, many inventions were created to help win the war. One example of this is duct tape. It was originally created to help keep moisture out of shipping containers being sent overseas, and has become a household item. Another invention is the famous Willys Jeep. The Jeep was able to climb a 45-degree slope, carry 3 fully armed soldiers, and run through 18 inches of water. Lastly, the pressurized cabin was created to help reduce the need for oxygen masks at high-altitude flights. According to BBC, aviation development really began during the First World War. At the time, planes were flimsy, wooden aircraft that were unarmed and unmaneuverable. The casualty rate of pilots was close to the infantry. Air-to-air combat occurred when opposing pilots would shoot at each other using handguns. By the end of the war, machine guns were mounted on the front of planes and were now maneuverable, and introduced a new type of warfare called dogfighting. The advancements made during World War I are nothing compared to the advancements made during the Second World War. During this time, the treatment for disease was not very effective. If any harmful bacteria got into a cut, it could possibly lead to death if the patient's immune system cannot fight it off. The common treatment at the time was to simply move you outside and hope you could recuperate from the fresh air. After the invention of antibiotics, infections caused by harmful bacteria were greatly reduced, and the ability to fight off infections was available. Apart from the breakthroughs of medicine, we see the creation of a new type of weapon that will end the war. This weapon is the atomic bomb and was a destructive new weapon. Although this was a weapon of mass destruction, it brought about the harnessing of nuclear energy. Many of the inventions and advancements made during World War II helped usher us into the modern era. The jet engine, pressurized cabin, and penicillin, and helicopters still benefit society by making travel easier. Medical advancements such as penicillin, the tetanus shot, and blood plasma allow society to become a healthier place. The atomic bomb brought an end to the war, changed the way we resolve conflict, and brought about the technology of nuclear energy. Aviation has been around for 100 years, and we have grown up around airplanes that the original creators could not even imagine. Any aircraft that uses jet propulsion has its roots in World War II. Before the invention of the jet engine, planes relied on propeller-driven engines. Two of the best propeller-driven planes were the American P-51 and the British Supermarine Spitfire. The famous engine used on these fighters was called the Merlin, not after the wizard from King Arthur, but from the bird of prey. The top speed of the Spitfire in late 1943 was 440 miles an hour. In comparison to the top speed of the German Messerschmitt 262, which was one of the first jet-powered fighters, was 540 miles an hour. Even after many years of developing and perfecting propeller engines, one of the first jet engines was 100 miles an hour faster than one of the best propeller engines. The purpose of the jet engine was to help the German fighters increase the lift, speed, payload, and range of the aircraft. This invention is being used in aircraft and other technologies to this day. Celine Hockabane from Time magazine says that today the jet engine, combined with a pressurized cabin, allows airliners to fly at an average of 31,000 feet. At these altitudes, airliners are able to fly more efficiently because of thinner air. This invention allows us to travel long distances quickly and efficiently. The jet engine may allow planes to fly at high altitudes, but there is an invention that allows passengers to comfortably fly these altitudes. Larry Boschers from the Federal Aviation Administration stated that before the use of the pressurized cabin, the threat of hypoxia was a real danger. Hypoxia is defined as the lack of sufficient oxygen to the blood, tissues, and/or cells. Hypoxia can occur when someone is flying above 10,000 feet without supplemental oxygen. Before World War II, they reduced the risk of hypoxia by wearing an oxygen mask during these high-altitude flights. George Larson from the Air and Space magazine explains that pressurized cabins work by taking air from the engines, pressurizing them using the turbofan, and then sending the air through a series of cooling systems. After these steps, cool air is pumped into the cabin, pressurizing the cabin. Modern airliners now use this invention in their airliners today. Final innovation in aviation from World War II is a helicopter. The Aviation Hall of Fame says that the creator is Igor Sikorsky, and he was born in modern-day Ukraine. At the age of 12, he built a crude model of the helicopter powered by rubber bands. Sikorsky realized that the technology at the time prevented him from creating the helicopter. In 1939, Igor Sikorsky was able to finally build the first helicopter. This new helicopter was the first of its kind and introduced a revolutionary new way to fly. During World War II, his new invention was finally put to the test. The American YR-4B was one of the first helicopters used during the war. This new type of aircraft first saw use in the Burmese jungle, when an aircraft was shot down carrying 3 wounded British soldiers. This new helicopter was sent in to help evacuate the wounded men from the crash site. Aberdeen Harmon, the pilot of the helicopter, took 3 trips rescuing the wounded soldiers. After some complications, including the engine failing due to heat, he was able to rescue the 3 men from the crash site. This new aircraft proved to be a useful tool in aiding those and rescuing individuals from places a plane cannot access. Today, helicopters can be used as air ambulances and carry injured personnel. Apart from saving lives, helicopters can be used in construction and the movement of people and supplies. From its early stages, a helicopter proved to be a useful tool for rescue efforts and is now used around the world to do the jobs planes may have trouble with. Before the war, medicine was not very effective because the treatments included sitting outside and hoping your immune system could fight it off. During the Second World War, many soldiers were wounded. Without an effective treatment for infections, these wounded soldiers often suffered and died from secondary infections. Celia Arnold from Chemical Engineering News says the solution to this problem is a new drug called penicillin. This new drug gained the government's interest because more soldiers died from infection from the wound than from the actual wound itself. Penicillin was able to combat these infections and save the lives of the soldiers. This drug has been around for a few years, but the Army's interest caused the mass production of penicillin and allowed it to be developed into more effective medication. By June 1944, there were 100 billion units being produced each month in the U.S. Additionally, World War II led to the invention of the tetanus vaccine and the use of blood plasma to help injured soldiers. The National World War II Museum describes the threat of blood loss on the field, saying that soldiers were shot who would bleed out, which could lead to shock. These wounded soldiers needed treatment for blood loss, and doctors soon discovered an effective treatment called blood plasma transfusion. Blood plasma prevents the loss of fluid, which sends the body into shock. This life-saving plasma could be dried and then stored for later use. A medic on the field would simply have to add water to it before giving it to a wounded soldier. Today, blood plasma is commonly given to trauma, burn, and shock patients, and people with severe liver disease or multiple clotting deficiencies. It also helps boost the patient's blood volume, which can prevent shock, and helps with blood clotting. A man heavily involved in the discoveries and use of blood plasma is Charles Drew. Drew was an African-American scientist who discovered how to separate the plasma from the blood. While Drew was researching this, he also discovered it could be dehydrated for better storage and longer shelf life. During his studies, Drew also discovered that everyone had the same blood plasma no matter the blood type of the donor or the person receiving it. This opened the door for medical personnel to prevent patients from going into shock. During the war, the program named Blood for Britain collected blood plasma from hospitals in New York and sent it to Britain to help treat soldiers in Britain. One report says Drew helped collect roughly 14,500 pints of blood plasma. Drew also became one of the first directors of the American Red Cross blood bank during the war. The discoveries that can be used today to help COVID-19. The FDA said that antibodies are proteins made by the body in response to infections. Convalescent plasma from patients who have already recovered from coronavirus disease may contain antibodies against COVID-19. They also said this: giving this convalescent plasma to hospitalized patients currently fighting COVID-19 may help them recover. In addition to the use of blood plasma during the war, there was a new vaccine that would save the lives at the Battle of Dunkirk. The National Vaccine Information Center says that during the First World War, many soldiers were infected with tetanus due to shrapnel wounds, increasing the death rate. A tetanus preventative was greatly needed to help reduce the death rate of soldiers. In the mid-1920s, they were able to produce an effective tetanus preventative using formaldehyde and heat. This new tetanus preventative would prove to be useful at the Battle of Dunkirk. Out of the 17,000 wounded soldiers who were already given their shot before the war, none of them contracted tetanus. Without blood plasma and the tetanus vaccine, we may not have life-saving tools to prevent infection from tetanus, help burn victims, and people going into shock. Finally, the atomic bomb brought an end to the war, changed the way we resolve conflict, and brought about the technology of nuclear energy. During the later years of the war, the Axis and Allied powers were still fighting with no end in sight. Alan Michael and Larry Schweikart, in their book, A Patriot's History of the United States, make it clear that Japan would keep fighting until they had no choice but to surrender. At the Battle of Saipan, American soldiers witnessed mothers clutching their babies, hurling themselves over the cliffs rather than be taken prisoner. This shows their willingness to fight. Allied leaders knew the only way to defeat Japan was to invade the homeland. However, they realized that invading Japan would be very bloody and costly. The Americans would be facing 350,000 Japanese soldiers, which would lead to an estimated 1 million American combat casualties. The expected casualties of Japanese civilians was between 1 to 9 million. Because Japan was unwilling to surrender, it became clear that the death toll on both sides would rise exponentially before the war would end. Allied leaders decided to use the new bombs to end the war early and prevent an invasion of Japan. Allied leaders dropped 750,000 leaflets over Hiroshima to warn them of the impending attack. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, leveling the city and taking the lives of 66,000 citizens. The destructive power of the atomic bomb was seen during the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the realization of its destructive power changed the way we resolve conflict. This new weapon introduced the idea of mutually assured destruction. This idea occurs when two opposing sides could use nuclear weapons to completely wipe out the other side, and therefore both sides would more readily agree to peace. The height of this fear was during the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were in an arms race trying to possess more nuclear warheads than the other. If one side fired, the other side would fire, leading to the destruction of both countries. Additionally, the Cuban Missile Crisis was an event that shook the world. The Soviet Union set up missiles in Cuba that could have easily reached the U.S. The U.S. and the Soviet Union came to an agreement after the U.S. set up a blockade around Cuba. The Soviets agreed to move the missiles in exchange for the U.S. not to invade Cuba. Today, countries must exercise caution when dealing with other countries to avoid nuclear warfare. Nuclear weapons also open the door to a new world of thinking and destruction. It has also opened the door for a cleaner and more efficient way to generate electricity. Before nuclear power plants relied on fossil fuels like coal and hydroelectric dams to generate electricity. These power plants were not very efficient and produced harmful smoke. When the atomic bomb was created, it opened the door for nuclear fission to be used in nuclear power plants around the world. According to GE Power, these plants run by splitting uranium atoms and using the heat to boil the water. The steam from the boiling water is then used to turn turbines, generating electricity. This method of energy production is clean and keeps the air on the plant breathable. The uranium fuel used consists of small, hard ceramic pellets that are packaged into long vertical tubes. Bundles of this fuel are then inserted into the reactor, and these pellets can last up to 5 years, and a single pellet is equal to 1 ton of coal, 3 barrels of oil, and 17,000 cubic feet of natural gas. These plants can generate more than 800 billion kilowatt hours a year. Nuclear power plants can run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and most nuclear power plants operate at full power more than 93% of the time, making them the most efficient power plants on the electrical grid. Nuclear power plants also provide 500,000 jobs across the U.S. and contribute an estimated $60 billion to the U.S. gross domestic product each year. The plants can also provide 700 workers with 30% higher salaries than the local average, and contribute billions of dollars each year to local economies through federal and state tax revenue. This new type of power production has allowed us to generate electricity cleanly and efficiently and provides money and jobs to the area around the plant. Critics will say that these inventions do not outweigh the millions that perished during the war. These people are right. These inventions came out of a very bloody war. The number of casualties during the war was an estimated 60 million dead and 25 million wounded. These inventions do not justify the loss of 60 million people. Their lives are simply not worth these material gains. We can, however, use these good things that came from a terrible war. Inventions such as penicillin were made to help save lives and not to take lives. The helicopter was not originally created as a weapon, but was simply as a new form of aviation. We can take these inventions that came out of this war and use them to help others. One example of this is during Hurricane Katrina. It was reported that 350 helicopters bringing in supplies and evacuating people. By September 3rd, an estimated 40,000 people had been evacuated by helicopters. Penicillin helps prevent death from secondary infection, as it helped bring new and stronger antibiotics to help combat infections and wounds. Many inventions from World War II have helped usher us into the modern era. Advancements in aviation, such as the helicopter, are being used to help fight fires and help injured personnel. Jet engines and pressurized cabins that, when used together, allow a plane to fly at high altitudes comfortably and efficiently. World War II also saw advancements in the medical field, such as the mass production of penicillin and the introduction of antibiotics. The tetanus preventative saved the lives of those exposed to tetanus, and blood plasma can help save patients going into shock. Lastly, the power of the atomic bomb ended the war and was harnessed to power cities across the world. Those who fought during the war were fighting for their countries and what they believed in. Little did they know that what they were fighting for would help shape the world we live in today. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Which of these inventions had the greatest impact?
Did you say when did they have the greatest impact?
No. Which of these inventions had the greatest impact?
I would probably have to say penicillin and antibiotics kind of related to that, because I think everybody in this room has probably had a cut at least one time and has had the risk of infection, and that penicillin can help take care of that infection. I don't think the other inventions are used as much, like nuclear power plants aren't used as much, as are not everywhere, and you can live without electricity, obviously, but I would say the most useful one is probably penicillin.
Would these inventions have happened without a war?
I would say they would. It would have taken a lot longer, though, because when the war happened, it created a huge need for these products, and without the need for the products, they wouldn't have been advanced as much as they were.
What made you choose this topic?
I've always liked to watch documentaries with my dad and just kind of study war. It's always been kind of fascinating to me. And I don't know why the Second World War, but it's always just been cool, like the carrier, like aircraft carriers and just the planes, they've always looked so cool to me, so. Yeah.
How did your research impact your thoughts on joining the United States Air Force? Also, thank you for considering this great service to our country.
I've always kind of been fascinated by planes, even though I can't really fly because I'm colorblind. But yeah, I've always liked planes. They've always been really cool to me, and I've always liked that era of planes, and I've always kind of liked to be around planes. So I think that's kind of one of the factors that has played into that.
Do you have any thoughts on how we can drive innovation for the common good without the motivation of international and life-threatening violence?
I say find a way to create a need, obviously not by war, but just kind of like, hey, we should have this kind of like, I guess, a convention maybe, like bring kind of that like a World's Fair back, something like that, maybe where you have a need for something, they can show off what they've made, and so people are creating instead of kind of just sitting around, so.
Are there other ways we've been influenced by World War II besides technology and medicine? For example, cultural, spiritual, and intellectual impact?
Definitely we have. I know art changed a lot after that. I'm not an art expert, obviously, but I know we've had that. We've had creation of like the Soviet Union and the fall of that, everything involved in that, the division of Germany, just many things that happened after the war that have influenced the world heavily, like NATO and all that stuff, so yes.
Is the resulting nuclear waste safer than other types of fuel?
Well, I researched this a little bit, but I don't know how to, if there's a word for it, but they de-radioactivate, if that's a word. They find a way to unradiate it, and then they'll just put it in a landfill because it's safe then. So after yeah.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Our next speaker tonight is Anna Chapin. Her advisor was Mrs. Julia Hankins, and her topic is The Missing Pieces, Rediscovering Artistic Beauty.
The Mona Lisa, The Last Supper, and Virgin on the Rocks are recognized worldwide as artistic masterpieces, but their creator, Leonardo da Vinci, did not recognize his accomplishments. Instead, he once said, "I have offended God and mankind because my work did not reach the quality it should have."
Da Vinci understood that he could always do better. He knew that he had potential and room to grow in his skills, and he believed that despite his amazing skill, he should continue to grow. Da Vinci understood that making great art takes effort, patience, and skill. However, throughout the years, many artists have strayed from that belief. Today, many art critics say that meaning is the only thing that matters in a piece, completely ignoring three other aspects of art: subject matter, skill, and truth. In this thesis, I will be focusing on the visual arts. Just as there are many different types of art, there are also many definitions of art. Art is the conscious use of skill and creative imagination, especially in the production of aesthetic objects. Roger Feldman, in his essay, The Point of Mass, says that visual art is the intentional use of visual principles applied to the visual elements. Art originated as a way of communication. Cave art, one of the earliest forms of artistry, was used to tell other groups of humans how to survive harsh conditions, as a way to tell stories, or even to create unity between the individuals of the group. By the medieval period of the 13th century, artists had clear narratives in their art, usually narratives from the Bible, and attempted to make their pieces as realistic as they could. In her book, Saving Leonardo, A Call to Resist the Secular Assault on Mind, Morals, and Meaning, Nancy Pearcey says that many artists conveyed the recent shift in theology. During the 13th century, theologians discovered that they did not have to separate themselves from nature to be close to God, and this led to a new focus on Jesus' humanity. Artists conveyed this by trying to make their pieces very realistic. Sometimes they would even look at the room or area where their piece would be displayed and include specific details of that space, making the piece look as if it were a part of that space. These artists wanted their audience to feel as though they were in the moment depicted, to make them feel as though they were just as much a part of the biblical scene as the characters themselves. Then there was a shift that focused on human autonomy. In the Enlightenment, artists showed how humans were in control of nature. This art showed realistic pastures and fields fenced and tamed by the wealthy, well-dressed upper class. In contrast, Impressionist artists in the 19th century conveyed the idea that we cannot understand the world as it truly is. They said that only through one's senses can someone understand the world around him. Because of this, the Impressionists decided to paint purely what their eyes saw, worrying about painting patches of color rather than focusing on form. 700 years later, Expressionism emerged. Expressionists believed that artists should express the state of their mind through their art. This movement was more concerned with the meaning of the piece, what the artist was trying to say, rather than the subject or skill of the piece. Today, the art world values complete randomness and chaos. Jackson Pollock, one of the most well-known and praised modern artists, would use random paint splatters to make his works, and for some pieces, title them using only numbers. Jerry Saltz, an American art critic who received the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism in 2018, speaks freely about his views on art and what he values in his article, How to Be an Artist, and his essay, Seeing Out Loud. In How to Be an Artist, Saltz wrote, "But art doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't even need to be good. This statement is similar to when Picasso said, everyone wants to understand art. Why not try to understand the song of a bird? However, Saltz contradicts himself in the very same article, saying art should contain emotions, and these ideas and feelings should be easy to understand, complex or not. Even this clear contradiction shows how some modern art critics value things that don't make sense. In his essay, Seeing Out Loud, Saltz explains what he looks for when he's critiquing artwork. I don't look for skill in art. I look for originality, something visionary, and a willingness to embarrass oneself in public. This core sample of the modern art world shows that it values meaning over skill, truth, and clear subject matter. However, the reality is this. Clear subject matter, skillful execution, and truth are all vital to the value of a work of art. Clear subject matter is important because it carries meaning, it grabs the attention of the audience, and reflects the creation God has made. Skillful execution is important because it allows the artist to communicate better, it creates beauty, and equips us to give our best to God. Truth is important to the value of a work because it gives the audience something to connect to, can cause people to change the way they think, and has the power to change the world. Clear subject matter, skillful execution, and truth are all vital to a value of the piece of work. First, clear subject matter, or what the piece of art is depicting, is vital to a piece. One reason it's important is because it grabs the attention of the audience. If someone does not linger to look at a piece, then he will not understand the meaning of the work. So the art piece must hold the viewer's attention. There have been several studies done to try and find out what grabs people's attention. Nadja Gauci recounts the findings of one such study in her article, Sorry Goldfish, People's Attention Spans Aren't Shrinking, They're Evolving. She says, based on the findings, it's content that features a compelling narrative combined with stimulating visuals and dialogue. If there is no interesting subject matter, no interesting main character, then no one will stick around long enough to see the meaning of the work. Therefore, if a work lacks clear subject matter, the meaning will be lost. Second, clear subject matter is vital because it's the carrier of the meaning. The subject matter is what the artist wants the audience to focus on so that they can see the meaning of the work. A great example of clear subject matter is Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam. In this outstanding work, it is very clear what's going on. Adam is reclining on the ground, handsome and strong like Michelangelo thought the first man ought to be. God is coming down from the other side, reaching his hand toward Adam to call him to life. There is nothing to confuse his audience or distract from what he wanted them to see, the power and majesty of Almighty God and the bond mankind had with their Creator before the fall. This intimate work is a great contrast to other works that lack clear subject matter, like Savage Breeze by Helen Frankenthaler. This piece shows two triangular blobs of green on top and bottom. The rest of the space is filled with a faded purple, and a thin yellow line streaks down the left edge. Once one learns that it is depicting an open space above a mountain-like divide, it starts to make sense. The problem with pieces like this is that there's no clear subject matter, no clear object to look at. The problem with pieces, there is no way to figure out the meaning if one does not even know what's going on in the piece. Without clear subject matter, the work is incomprehensible. Like an actor who plays a part in a play, the subject matter of a work plays its part by carrying the meaning. Without clear subject matter, the meaning of the piece will be lost or never found in the first place. Third, clear subject matter is important because it reflects the world God has made. In Genesis chapters 1 and 2, God created the earth and everything in it, and when he was done, he called his creation good. God created the universe with clear subject matter. There are no paint splatters in his design. There are no accidents. Everything has a unique purpose given by God, and everything will fulfill its specific purpose, even if that purpose does not seem useful. Because the universe is made of clear subject matter, any work of art that has clear subject matter is reflecting God's universe. Not only is subject matter important, but so is skillful execution. If a piece is done with skill, then one can communicate better through it. A bare-bones drawing of a stick man in a room will give the viewer a very basic idea of what's going on, but a fleshed-out image, one with form, shading, and color, will convey so much more than the aforementioned image ever could, such as the mood and expressions of the man in the room. Fred Ross, an author and chairman for the Art Renewal Center, explained that the arts originated as a language and are used for communication. He says the vocabulary of fine arts is realistic image, which we see everywhere throughout our lives, and the grammar are the rules and skills needed to successfully render that image. Skills are as vital to art as grammar is to a language. If someone does not follow the grammatical rules of his language, then no one will be able to understand him. Skill must be used in order for people to fully understand what the artist is saying in her work. Skill is also important because it creates beauty, which reflects the truth, beauty, and goodness of God. In his work, Art for God's Sake, A Call to Reclaim the Arts, Philip Graham Ryken notes that God has high standards for art. He says, God's aesthetic standards include goodness, truth, and beauty, and these standards are not relative, they are absolute. God has these standards because he himself is true, beautiful, and good, and when he created the universe, he made it to be true, beautiful, and good as well. Genesis 1:31 says, God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Gorgeous summer sunsets, emerald green forest, the stunning hues in bird feathers, and the stars and planets above are all examples of the beautiful works the Lord has made. Because God creates things that are true, beautiful, and good, those that he created to be his sub-creators ought to do the same as well. Skillful execution is vital because we ought to give our best to God. God has a high standard for art, and he showed us this when he gave the instructions for the construction and decoration of the tabernacle in chapters 25 through 30 of Exodus. The tabernacle served not only the utilitarian purpose of being the place where God himself dwells, and where the people were able to give their sacrifices to the Lord, but also served as a work of art itself. In the instructions God gave, gold, silver, bronze, onyx stones, and incense are just a few of the requirements for his temple. God wanted his temple to not only serve the purpose of being a dwelling place for him, but also to be beautiful, just as he is beautiful. Chapter 31 tells of how God gave two men, Bezalel and Aholiab, the ability to carry out these instructions and lead others to help them complete the task he set before them. This shows us that God expects us to give him our very best, and that he has given us the tools we need to do our best. Finally, truth is important to the value of a work of art, because people are drawn to universal truths and can connect to them. William Bouguereau, born in 1825, was an artist who earned the title master painter through his near perfection in painting flesh tone and conquering form in his works. When viewers consider William Bouguereau's flagellation of our Lord Jesus Christ, they will first be struck by the demonstrated skill and beauty throughout the piece, despite its desperate setting. The moment he chose to depict is a calm before the storm moment, right before the first lash is given. The look on Christ's face as he is bound and surrounded by onlookers is not one of anger or fear, but one of complete peace. Christians can relate to the truth Bouguereau clearly and skillfully shows here, that God so loved the world that he gave his only Son to die for our sins, and that Christ was willing to do so. Similarly, in his piece entitled The First Morning, viewers will see the pain of Adam and Eve as they lament the death of their son Abel. They will see a completely broken Eve whose face is buried in the chest of Adam, who is trying desperately to stay strong for his wife despite the lifeless body of their son draped across his lap. Anyone who has ever lost a loved one, especially those who have lost a child, will be able to connect to the harsh truth of this scene. Losing a loved one is one of the hardest things anyone will ever go through. Modern art, however, can be very difficult to connect to because the truth of these is either not in it, or it is very hard to be seen for the lack of clear subject matter and skill. The truth of a work makes the audience able to connect with the piece, which makes the viewer's artistic experience more meaningful. Truth is vital because it can also provoke people to think about things in a different way. An example of this is the work of Derek Robertson, an artist who calls attention to the refugee crisis in the Middle East and Europe in his exhibition, Migrations, a field study of adversity. In these works, Robertson paints what he sees on his journeys, creating pictures of birds alongside people. He shows the connections between the migrations of the birds and the migrations of the refugees. He says, art can work intuitively and emotionally. These are really hard issues to confront, and people often close down rather than engage. I hope my work can draw people in and begin to engage with them about bypassing the reservations and defenses and get them to recognize our shared humanity. Robertson uses the truth in his pieces to get people to reframe their previous prejudices and see refugees as people. The power to change the way people think is huge and comes with a lot of responsibility, so truth should not be ignored in a work of art. Truth is also important in art because it has helped change societies. In the Victorian era, many artists used their skill to bring attention to injustices towards women, children, and minorities. Fred Ross, in his article, The Great 20th Century Art Scam, talks about how many Victorian artists loved making women the main subject matter of their works. These women were shown as independent and having souls of their own. During this time, women's rights were fought for the first time in history, and having women depicted as their own person helped the movement forward. And over the next 100 years, women got the rights that made them almost equal to their male counterparts. This was a huge step in equality for women, and it may not have happened if not for the art of the Victorian era. All of this clearly shows that truth, skillful execution, and clear subject matter are all important to the value of a work of art. Some people might say that gaudy, distasteful, or shocking art provokes more attention and is therefore more valuable. Some artists have risen to fame for creating shocking art, such as Robert Mapplethorpe and André Serrano. However, the shock factor pushes people away. In her essay, Beauty Transformed, Adrienne Chaplin says that things that are not beautiful often get ignored unless they are absolutely horrendous. The shock factor can definitely bring attention to one's work, but it should not and does not bring praise. If artists want to do something truly revolutionary with their work, then they ought to express humans' emotions and experiences, good or bad ones, and strive to do so in a way that is beautiful. Despite what some modern art critics want us to think, truth, significant subject matter, and skillful execution are just as important to the value of a piece of art as the meaning. Subject matter carries the meaning, grabs the attention of the audience, and reflects the beautiful world God has made. Skillful execution creates beauty and allows the artist to better communicate through her work. Artists also ought to use skill in their works because we are called to do everything to the best of our ability, for the glory of God. Truth gives the audience something to connect to, causes people to think differently about things, and has the power to change whole societies. These artistic elements are all needed to create truly grand works of art. Let us praise great works of art and encourage artists to continue to create such works, and let those who create art recognize the importance of subject matter, skill, and truth in their works. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. What would you say to those who say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder?
I think people have different tastes in things, but some tastes need to be refined a bit. I know some people prefer a more cartoonish sort of style in art, and some people prefer a more realistic view, but I think what's really important is if it's clear to see what's going on, if there is a point behind it, and mainly if it's clear. That's the main thing.
What is the most beautiful work of art to you?
I can't give you a straight answer for that. There's so many good ones. Gosh.
One of your favorites.
We could be here all day. So there is a piece at the Birmingham Museum of Art. I think it's Morning over Yosemite Park. It's huge and it's absolutely gorgeous. And they say there's no animals in it, but someone says they found a bird. It's a great treasure hunt and it's gorgeous.
Is someone who works to the glory of God and to the best of their ability creating good art, even if it's a visual train wreck?
Yes. Okay. Big thing that I didn't get to talk about in my thesis that I really wanted to is it's important to try your best, and again, to work for the glory of God. So if your child wants to try his best and it doesn't look great, but he really tried, encourage him in that. And these talents only grow with time. No one ever starts out looking how, Michelangelo started drawing right before he died. These all take time. It all takes practice, hard work, effort, and that's not gonna come just straight away. So encouragement, practice, all good things.
Does a work of art need to be immediately understandable to a viewer in order to be successful?
I don't think so. I think it's important. I think there are some really good works out there that it just takes time to look at, and I think the best pieces will have you coming back again and again and finding new things every time. So definitely not.
Are there any modern artists that you admire who produce good art?
Oh, sorry.
Who produce good art?
Oh, okay. Do we know if they mean like modern art as in just close to the time now, or that they make art that fits that kind of bill?
Either. Your choice.
There are several artists that I follow on Instagram that make great art that live currently. They're in their like 30s or 40s or 20s. So I'll say yes, there are, but I don't think I'll ever say to someone who just paints squares that it's really good. I mean, it might look good. It might look good. And that's another, modern art can have a pleasing visual quality, but sometimes that's it. And I think it needs to have a bit more depth to it, so yes.
Why does art need to have a meaning or message to reflect the Creator? Is visual beauty not sufficient for reflecting God?
That's a great question. I think it can, but the world around us has substance. It has a meat to it. You can find out what God is like through his creation. We know that he likes order. We know for some reason he likes math. He likes all these things that are, and I think that should be the same with artists as well. If you see a piece, you can kind of figure out what that person is like through their work. Same with authors and musicians and all that.
Why do you think the art world has abandoned clear subject matter, skillful execution, and truth? How might these be reclaimed?
Could I get that last part of that question again?
How might these be reclaimed?
Okay, so similar to what Mr. Simoneaux said over here, war, things that have happened, tragedies that have happened throughout time have definitely changed our mindset. There was a big shift to kind of hopelessness and depression after the world wars for obvious reasons. These things can really traumatize people, and they reflect that through their art to help them cope. And then patterns have emerged, people just with time, different ideologies rising and falling. That has a lot to do with it. Reclaiming is just gonna have to be recognizing that I really do believe there should be depth to this. If you really wanna, as Christians, if you want to reflect God's beauty, truth, goodness, that needs to be shown through your art. So it's just a matter of doing it.
Thank you, Anna.
next speaker tonight is Caleb Chapin. His advisor was Mrs. Kyra Woodman, and his topic is Different, Not Less, Understanding the Autism Spectrum.
Panic, darkness, chaos. 1,000 bombs were going off in my head. The explosions never stopped, only getting worse and worse by the minute. A violent war was raging, but only I could see it. I was going through a major panic attack at just the age of just 14, caused by hypersensitivity due to autism. I was diagnosed with autism around 7 or 8 years old and had a lot of quirks and symptoms. However, I had never experienced anything like this. The only one who was getting me through this chaotic panic was my sister. I wasn't scared. I was angry. Why was it that my sister was the only one who was willing to help me? My parents were kind and merciful people to those around them. Did they not see that their child was suffering? The only explanation I could think of was ignorance. My parents didn't understand what was going on, so how could they help me? And so I have dedicated this thesis to that very topic, to try and educate those willing to learn about the true nature of autism. The term autism was first used by German psychiatrist Eugene Buehler in 1911. Autistic thinking, according to Buehler, was characterized by an infantile desire and to avoid unsatisfying realities and replace them with entertaining fantasies. Dr. Leo Kanner began observations in 1943, studying several children who preferred sameness and routine, related to people who differently than normal, used more literal language, and had difficulty with figures of speech. These traits are now considered hallmark of high-functioning autism. In the 1970s, with further research, scientists came to use the term in a different way. Autism was soon realized as a lack of fantasy and invention, rather than an excess of it. With all these contradicting definitions of what autism was, the concept was, understandably, confusing for most. According to Temple Grandin, one of the most famous autism advocates in the world, and a person with autism herself, the general population did not know exactly what autism was due to lack of information and research in the 1950s and 60s. And symptoms were still a mystery to the general populace, even after decades of research. The Autism Society of America was founded in 1965 by Bernard Rimland and a small group of parents with autism children to further educate people about autism. Later, Temple Grandin began speaking to audiences in the 1980s in order to educate others about the autism spectrum as a whole. Today, confusion still exists among the general population as to what autism exactly is. According to the Autism Society of America, stereotypes are commonplace, with words like retarded still being used as an insult. Despite all the research, most people are still misinformed about what autism really is. Confusion and misconceptions often lead to difficult and even harmful interaction with those who have autism. Education about autism can help with this prominent issue. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, autism spectrum disorder is a developmental disability that can cause significant social, communicational, and behavioral challenges. Autism Speaks defines Asperger's syndrome as a previously used diagnosis on the autism spectrum. It's been recently simply referred to as high-functioning autism. When someone mentions that a person is on the spectrum, it simply means that they have symptoms or a complete diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. In order for people on the spectrum to fully participate in society, the true nature of autism must be made known. First, autism is a vast and diverse spectrum, one with a variety of symptoms and varying degrees of severity, affecting a large portion of the world. Second, autism can affect the body as well as the brain, but it does not affect one's intelligence or value in society. Finally, those with autism are indeed different, but they should not be viewed as inferior due to their differences in ways of thinking. Autism is indeed a vast and diverse spectrum, one with a variety of symptoms and varying degrees of severity, as well as covering a large part of the world population. First, according to Autism Speaks, one of the most well-known and well-documented autism sources in the world, there are various symptoms that are included in the autism spectrum. Some of these symptoms are behavioral, such as a desire for sameness and routine, hypersensitivities, and extreme clumsiness. These behaviors, particularly those of hypersensitivities, can be misinterpreted by some people as poor behavioral management. However, people with autism cannot necessarily control their outbursts or panic attacks. Those interacting with people on the spectrum should be patient and supportive when these things happen. Other symptoms are communicational, such as trouble with nonverbal communicational skills, such as personal space, volume, tone, etc. Difficulty with figures of speech, and difficulties with the give and take of conversation. While these symptoms may be problems early on, those with autism can be taught conversational skills. It just may take more time. Still, other symptoms are social, such as trouble identifying emotions, difficulty expressing emotions, and problems with eye contact and hand gestures. These symptoms may be the most challenging. Those in the spectrum may have trouble knowing which emotions someone is expressing and say something completely uncalled for or mean. They may not necessarily mean it to be harsh, but it can be a real challenge for those on the spectrum and those around them. However, some on the spectrum are able to learn if they are taught with patience. Not only are there a variety of symptoms, but there are also varying degrees of severity within the autism spectrum. In Temple Grandin and Richard Panik's book, The Autistic Brain, Thinking Across the Spectrum, they state that at one end of the spectrum, you may find the severely disabled. At the other end, you might encounter an Einstein or Steve Jobs. There is low-functioning autism, where the brain-to-body connection is hindered in some way, such as immobility, nonverbal autism. And then there is high-functioning autism, where the connection between the body and the brain is heightened to the point of hypersensitivity. Tony Atwood states in his book, The Complete Guide to Asperger's Syndrome, that those with Asperger's usually have a fascination with a topic that is unusual in either intensity or focus. Autism is a vast spectrum with a variety of symptoms and degrees in severity. More in-depth research into these effects can give a better understanding of what those on the spectrum deal with on a regular basis. Furthermore, the autism spectrum can also affects people in many different countries and a large portion of the world. According to the Autism Society, more than 3.5 million Americans are living with an autism spectrum disorder. Also, 1% of the adult population of the United Kingdom has autism spectrum disorder. Lastly, about 700 million people, or 1% of the entire world population, has autism spectrum disorder. Contrary to popular belief, autism is not just a disability limited to a small group of people. Autism can affect anyone and actually affects a relatively large portion of the world population. Second, autism can affect the body as well as the brain, but it does not at all affect one's intelligence or value in society. As previously mentioned, low-functioning autism can cause severe hindrances. According to Autism Speaks, around 1/3 of people with autism are nonverbal, meaning that the person has trouble speaking or cannot speak at all. However, one's intelligence is not merely based on verbal skills. In her book, The Way I See It, A Personal Look at Autism and Asperger's, Temple Grandin states the following: as a society, we equate intelligence with language. Smart people are verbal people. People who cannot use language well are perceived as dumb. However, bit by bit, those on the spectrum are deflating the notion that not being able to speak means not having anything to say. Even if someone cannot speak, that does not mean that he or she cannot thrive. Grandin later states that there are many nonverbal people on the spectrum who have written books about their experiences and trials, showing how they have learned through their own way of thinking and inspiring others in the process. Autism syndrome, Asperger's syndrome can also affect the brain and body in multiple ways. Common symptoms of Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism are clumsiness and an adherence to routine or patterns. as well as various sensitivities to taste and touch. Dr. Tony Atwood writes that those with Asperger's can have vivid imaginations and special interests. These fascinating and sometimes unique interests can result in innovation and creativity that the world most desperately needs. There are many major historical contributors to society who might have had autism or Asperger's syndrome. According to the Applied Behavioral Analysis Guide, Sir Isaac Newton might have had autism. Newton isolated himself from people as much as possible and relied strongly on routine, a key indicator of high-functioning autism. Another famous person that could have had autism is famous American poet Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson was reclusive most of her life, wore white almost exclusively, and got along best with children. Many argue that it was Dickinson's epilepsy, not autism, that made her so reclusive. However, those with autism do have a higher chance of epilepsy. Lastly, award-winning actor Dan Aykroyd, the creator of the famous Ghostbusters franchise, has autism. Dan Aykroyd later said on Everyday Health that one of my symptoms includes an obsession with ghosts and law enforcement. I carried a police badge with me, for example. I became obsessed with Hans Holzer, the greatest Ghostbuster ever. That is when the idea of my film Ghostbusters was born. All these people and so many others prove that those on the spectrum can and have done great things in society. And this should be an encouragement for all on the spectrum to pursue greatness and excellence, not just the mundane. Lastly, according to Temple Grandin, there are multiple types of thinkers within the spectrum. There are visual thinkers who can imagine ideas and pictures and even take mental snapshots of their surroundings. There are also pattern thinkers who can memorize easily by use of organization and rhythm. Then there are verbal thinkers who are natural speakers and tend to be more mature or sophisticated in their wording. There are many different ways of thinking and viewing the world through the eyes of autism. Those on the spectrum can fall into one or more of these categories or a combination of them as well. Finally, those with autism are indeed different, but they should not at all be treated as inferior. A major problem for those on the spectrum is bullying. According to Autism Speaks, nearly 2/3 of autistic children between the ages of 6 and 15 years old have been emotionally or physically mistreated. This is much higher than the national average of 20% between the ages of 12 and 18 years old. Education about other ways of thinking and activities among like-minded individuals may be a good solution to this prominent issue. If those on the spectrum can find a place where they can thrive and feel included, then their chances for success in society increases dramatically. Everyone should be educated on what autism is so that this trend of bullying no longer continues in our society. Finally, as Christians, we should strive to see those on the spectrum as God sees them. Genesis 1:27 says, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Every person on this planet has been created in the image of God and should be treated with dignity and respect. Those on the spectrum are included in this category. In John 13:34, Jesus tells his disciples, a new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you. As Christians, we should care for people with autism as God does, loving them and helping them in any way we can, no matter what. Some practical ways we can help is by relating to them and trying to understand how and why they view the world, and adapting to their needs as much as possible. Those wanting to help can start by having a conversation with someone on the spectrum, or a parent of one if need be, to better understand what they are going through. If there is someone who is struggling with certain aspects of autism, we must be loving and kind toward them in the best way we can, and understand where they are coming from. This is how Christ would want us to behave toward those on the spectrum, and so we should strive to do so to the best of our ability. Still, others don't see why we should adapt to people with autism. Shouldn't they adapt to typical standards of behavior? However, this assumes that there is a single standard of behavior. There are billions of people, all of whom have different ways of behaving in the world around them. Those with autism are no different. If a person is sensitive to certain clothing and reacts negatively to that, then why not look for a better alternative? All of us should be caring and supportive to those around us. This, of course, includes those with autism. Autism is a diverse spectrum that can affect the body as well as the brain. Those on the spectrum are indeed different, but should not be considered inferior. Ignorance and stigma still exist concerning autism, but this should not be the case. Autism is no different from any other condition and does not affect their being created in the image of God. May those listening be willing to take these words to heart and take the time and effort to do their own research and be a voice to those who may not have one. Thank you.
Thank you, Caleb. How can the church minister to people with autism and their families?
So I think a really good way to minister to them is to relate to them and try to understand their needs and their struggles. And like, I guess one example would be that if the child is sensitive to hearing and stuff, that the church could supply another room for the child to listen to the service and listen to the music, and for a safe place, and to where if he has a panic attack or outburst, that he could have access to that and with his family. So,
What is one thing that classical Christian educators could do to help students with learning differences?
So I think it's really just like based on just teaching people about different ways of thinking and teaching that exists, because a lot of people don't know that it exists to this extent. And so I think just education about it in general would just plant that little nugget of knowledge.
Are there circumstances where autism could be considered a strength?
Yes, obviously, like there's been examples of that I've just mentioned about people with autism like using their different quirks and obsessions and gifts for society, and so I think it really can help society.
Is the cause for autism known?
So there aren't many known causes. The main one that I could find was like if one or more of the parents are like over the age of 40 or like older, and that if one or more of the parents has a history of autism disorder.
What is one thing that you learned in your research that was an encouragement to you?
So I think the real encouragement was just like how, like there was a long list. If you look at the Applied Behavior Analysis Guide, like it just shows you like a list of like all of the different people that could have had autism. And I say could have because most of them lived like prior to when autism was known and the diagnoses were presented, but yeah.
Can you talk more about the challenges that people with autism experience with lack of coordination?
Can you repeat the last part?
With lack of coordination.
So I think it's definitely like, so like based on like coordination, like knowledge of it, I'm guessing.
I think the reference is to, you reference clumsiness in your thesis?
Okay, so with like clumsiness, I can definitely see like bullying is a main thing, because obviously like, you know, some kid like walking down the hallway with autism and he trips over something, and then like kids bully him, or just the way he walks or talks and stuff like that would definitely be an issue. But again, education could help with that.
Thank you, Caleb.
Thank you.
Our final speaker tonight is Kathryn Kautz. Her advisor was Mrs. Jennifer Scott, and her topic is The Invisible Thread, Culture and the Mind.
My tribe had always idealized treachery. It was something to celebrate. I remember a story about a man who had invited his friends over for an all-night dance, but slaughtered them before it was over. He was greatly honored, and his story was told for generations. However, there was one way to create a bond of trust that could not be broken. In order to truly establish trust with another clan, our tribes had to exchange 2 young children to allow for a relationship between us. A child who was switched to another tribe to establish harmony was called a peace child. This true story, adapted from Don Richardson's Peace Child, shows how vastly different cultures can be. Most cultures value honesty, but the culture of this New Guinea tribe valued deception. Can culture really have such a great impact on our mind's perception of relationships? Culture is defined as the unique ideas and customs of a people or a group that are passed along to succeeding generations. For the purposes of my thesis, my research has primarily focused on European and American culture, which I will refer to as Western culture, and East Asian culture, which I will refer to as Eastern culture. Since Eastern culture and Western culture are so drastically different, the thought processes of the people living in them are also on opposite sides of the psychological spectrum. Cross-cultural psychology focuses on the effects of culture on a person's behavior and the mind. In the 1970s, Geert Hofstede, a Dutch social psychologist, surveyed over 100,000 people from 50 different countries and outlined the key differences in behaviors. This analysis was the first major cross-cultural study. From this, he outlined a group of dimensions through which most psychologists still characterize countries today. 2 of these dimensions are individualism versus collectivism and masculinity versus femininity. Cross-cultural psychology is continually gaining more importance in the study of the mind. Although the history of cross-cultural psychology may be relatively brief, the things one can learn from this branch of study are very useful in understanding people's behaviors and relationships. Culture influences one's perception of oneself, of others, and even of God. It affects one's view of oneself, specifically through individualism, collectivism, and successes and failures. It affects one's view of others by influencing trust and gender stereotypes, and even by physically altering neurological pathways of the brain. And lastly, culture affects one's view of God regarding reception of the gospel, the impact of individualism and collectivism, and cross-cultural ministry. The first way that culture molds individual minds is that it influences one's perception of oneself. An example of this is the high value Western culture places on individualism. Individualistic cultures focus on the needs and desires of the individual rather than a group. Geert Hofstede created a scale of individualism that measures how much people in a culture value their personal needs over the needs of a group. The most individualistic country in Western culture, the United States, scored a 91 out of 120 on the individualism scale in Hofstede's research. One way to see the prominent individualism of Western culture is by analyzing its sayings. Hazel R. Marcus and Shinobu Kitayama point out something that Western adults may say to their children who are reluctant to eat their food. The parents may tell their children to think of the starving kids in Africa, and then to think about how blessed they are to have enough food to eat. They say this in hopes that their children will appreciate their good fortune and finish their meal. This shows the individualism of Western cultures because it focuses on the individual rather than another. In contrast with Western culture, Eastern cultural values include collectivism. Collectivistic cultures place emphasis on the individual's identification with a group. Eastern culture's most collectivistic country, China, scored a 20 out of 120 on the individualism scale. Just like Western cultures, Eastern cultures also have an aphorism to tell their children who are reluctant to eat all of their food. The parents tell their children to think about the farmer who grew their food and to think about how he would feel if they didn't finish their meal. Instead of telling their children to think about how fortunate they are, These parents remind their children to think about the person who prepared their food and to finish it because others put effort into preparing it. This example illustrates how Eastern cultures think in a collectivistic manner because they use others as their motivation. Culture also influences self-perception in terms of successes and failures. Individuals in Western cultures tend to assume more personal responsibility for their successes, while people from Eastern cultures take more responsibility for their failures. For example, imagine two people at work, one from an Eastern culture and the other from a Western culture. A tree falls right outside the building, which distracts the two employees from their work so that they are unable to complete an important task. The worker from an Eastern culture is more likely to say that he was to blame for getting distracted, but the worker from a Western culture would be more likely to blame the tree. Thus, culture influences one's view of oneself through differing ideas of individualism, collectivism, and successes and failures. Another way the culture influences the mind is through one's perception of others. Culture impacts our relationships by influencing whom we trust. For instance, people from Eastern cultures tend to value calm, whereas people from Western cultures tend to value excitedness. Milenko Martinovich describes a study in which participants were told to choose the virtual avatar that they found the most trustworthy out of a group of people from all different races, sexes, and emotional expressions. The Western participants generally chose avatars who showed excited expressions, while Eastern participants chose those who showed calm dispositions. These findings show that culture influences our view of those whom we find the most trustworthy. Another way culture affects our view of others is through gender stereotypes. Gender stereotypes are not universal as one may suppose, but rather are moderated by cultural values. Culture shapes gender stereotypes in that men are perceived as possessing more of whatever trait the culture values. Therefore, in Western cultures, men are considered as more individualistic than women. In Eastern cultures, men are considered as more collectivistic, since Eastern cultures value collectivism and Western cultures value individualism. For instance, when men in a Western culture have a large network of casual friends, they are praised. However, in an Eastern culture, men are praised for having a small network of close friends. Culture affects the view of the two genders and therefore greatly influences how people perceive others. Culture even shapes the neural pathways one's brain takes when thinking of others. A study was performed in which Western and Eastern participants were told to think about themselves and then about their mother and a famous person. Shi Hui Han and George Northoff tell us that the participants from both cultures used the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, the VMPFC, used in processing self-referential stimuli to think about themselves. However, when they were told to think about their mother and a celebrity, the Eastern participants used the VMPFC at the same level as before, whereas the Western participants used that part of the brain significantly less. The Eastern participants' minds placed their mothers and celebrities on the same level as themselves. Even neurologically, people from Eastern cultures are more interwoven with the people around them because of their collectivism, but people from Western cultures tend to separate themselves from the community because of their individualism. The culture influences our view of others through the very pathways by which our brains process information about others. Lastly, culture influences one's perception of God. One way this cultural influence is clearly seen is through one's perception of the gospel. A defining property of East Asian thought, for instance, is that humans are naturally good and are able to perfect themselves by hard work. Because of this worldview, people influenced by Eastern cultures may find it challenging to accept the doctrine of original sin. In contrast, people from Western cultures tend to recognize their sinfulness, which could lead to Westerners being more open to repentance. However, they also tend to rely on their own capabilities rather than turning to the only one who can truly help them. In seeking to better oneself, one may try diets or meditation, but the only way to redemption is through Jesus Christ. The link between Christianity and culture is also influenced by individualism and collectivism. Because of their collectivism, Eastern converts are more likely to share their new views with others in their community, leading them to Christ. However, in a Western culture, a convert's decision is much less likely to affect those around them. A Western church's mission statement is often drastically different from an Eastern church's. Churches in Western culture have more individualistic themes in their mission statements, showing their focus on the individual's personal relationship with God. Churches in Eastern cultures contain more motifs of social interaction and affiliation than those in Western culture, showing the interdependence of collectivistic cultures. For example, Eastern churches may say that one of their goals is to form a fellowship among people. But Western cultures may say that they try to provide opportunities for Christian nurture, care, and spiritual growth. Because Eastern culture is immersed in collectivism and Western culture is saturated in individualism, these differences affect how one perceives Christianity. The culture's influence on one's perception of God ought to be taken into account during ministry, especially on the mission field. When one understands how a culture perceives God, it allows for one to evangelize more effectively. For example, if a missionary from a Western culture went to spread the gospel to a country that is influenced by Eastern culture, but did not take the culture's influences into account, he or she may not understand that Eastern cultures do not tend to see people as naturally sinful. This could lead the missionary to begin talking about sinful human nature and offending the people he or she is trying to convert, making it much harder to share the gospel. However, if an Eastern missionary was trying to convert someone from a Western culture and explain the same idea of sinfulness, the Westerner may seek to correct him or herself without the power of the gospel. Since culture influences how one perceives God, Christians must consider these differences when ministering cross-culturally. Some may say that this thesis promotes the view of determinism, the belief that one's actions and views are only a product of circumstances and upbringing. There is a major difference, however, between subconscious tendency and consciously choosing to do something. I am not arguing that culture negates personal responsibility. Culture itself does play a huge role in one's views and thoughts, and he or she will be prone to tendencies that are distinctive of his or her culture. This does not mean, however, that one has an excuse for sinful behaviors, because everyone will eventually answer to God for his or her actions. Of course, no one is ever too far for God to change, and anyone can look to God to turn his or her life around, despite cultural tendencies. Culture influences how one perceives oneself, as seen through individualism, collectivism, and responses to success and failure. It influences one's perception of others, shown by trust, gender stereotypes, and neurological differences. And finally, it influences one's perception of God, seen in reception of the gospel, individualism and collectivism, and ministry. The culture itself plays such a large role in one's day-to-day life that people ought to be aware of this influence. Everyone needs to be aware of the link between culture and the mind and how it affects every aspect of relationships. The true story from the Peace Child, as referenced in my introduction, is about missionaries who went to New Guinea and ministered to a cannibalistic tribe called the Sawi. The tribe's concept of a peace child allowed the missionaries to explain that Jesus is like a peace child between us and God. God sent his son Jesus to live with us on earth and to establish a relationship, just like the peace child establishes a relationship between two tribes. The missionaries used the Sawi culture to minister to them and to convert the whole tribe. Because the culture's impact is so great, these missionaries were able to use the culture to explain something outside of it. In order to understand oneself and others, it is crucial to take into account the impact of culture on the mind. Culture affects one's mind and creates an invisible thread between the world outside and the person within. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna Kathryn. Do people from more individualistic cultures have more difficulty understanding the Bible? Can you think of any examples?
In my research, I didn't find anything except the fact that they do tend to understand things and take things more personally. So like with the sin thing, the doctrine of original sin, they accept that, but they might reject God in trying to deal with that. And so they would correct themselves with worldly things rather than turning to Jesus.
We often hear that Eastern countries have become westernized. Is there any evidence for the reverse occurring?
In my research, I didn't find anything like that. So I would say that, as far as I can tell, no.
Do Christians need to become more Eastern in their thinking in order to understand the Bible, particularly the Old Testament?
I think both Eastern and Western culture have their own good things about them and their own bad things about them. And so I think in order to truly see the world how we are supposed to, we need to align our culture with how God has created it to be. And so that means taking from Eastern culture and taking from Western culture and mixing them and finding the perfect balance.
Did your research reveal the same tendencies, such as individualism versus collectivism, in Middle Eastern countries such as Africa and South America?
In my thesis, I did not do any research on other countries other than Eastern and Western culture.
How would you respond to someone who thinks that Christianity is a Western religion?
I don't think you can pin that on Christianity because its culture is something that is made up of individuals' tendencies, and that is passed along to other people in the same culture. And so to say that Christianity is Western, you can't do that because I mean, it didn't start in a Western culture, really, so, no.
In a global society, have the lines blurred between collectivism and individualism?
Can you repeat that, please?
Sorry. In a global society, have the lines blurred between collectivism and individualism? Or between Eastern and Western culture?
Do you mean like... By global society, do you mean like...
I guess, are the two societies less distinctive, or two cultures less distinctive now than they used to be?
I think they can be because there's so much overlap in immigration. So like with Western culture, America is a melting pot of all different cultures, and it takes on the Western culture, but it does still have the people from Eastern culture in it. And so I think they can blend in certain areas.
Are there any aspects of Eastern and Western culture that they both have in common?
For my thesis, I mainly was searching for the differences, not the similarities. So I wasn't looking for that, and I didn't find anything like that.
How can missionaries prepare to minister to other cultures?
Definitely taking classes, like ministry classes, to prepare them for that, and definitely creating relationships with other people from those specific cultures, so you can understand their views and how they understand things, so that you're able to effectively minister to them.
Thank you, Anna Kathryn.
Well, how about those seniors? What an awesome night. And we're not done yet. Well, we are for tonight. Don't get scared. We have another wonderful night planned Thursday, so I look forward to seeing y'all back. And I want to close this in prayer tonight, if y'all will join me. Father, thank you so much for this evening. Thank you for all the hard work that these students put into these presentations, all of the interesting things that they've given us to think about. And I pray that you would bless them, and I pray that you would help them in their future decisions of all the things that you have for them in their lives. And I pray that you would bless our school and continue to raise up young men and women like this who will educate us as we educate them. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Good night.